The drawing-room of Blackwood Estate had never been so quiet. Theodosia Blackmore sat beside the tall window with a book open across her lap, though she had not turned a page in over an hour. The afternoon light fell across the embroidered armrest in long golden strips. Outside, the elm trees had begun to drop their leaves, and the gardeners moved slowly between the hedgerows, raking the fallen gold into careful piles that the wind scattered before they could finish. She heard the maid's footsteps before she heard the voice. "Your Grace." The girl stopped in the doorway. Her hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "She's here." Theodosia did not look up. She closed the book with one hand, smoothing the cover with her thumb. "Show her in." The maid hesitated one full second before disappearing. In that second, Theodosia set the book on the side table, straightened the sleeve of her afternoon dress, and arranged her face into the expression she had spent 7 years perfecting. Not warmth, exactly. Something that looked like warmth from across a room. Lady Lettice Fairmont entered the drawing-room wearing a smile so wide it reached her ears. She was dressed in pale rose silk, her dark hair pinned in elaborate curls that must have taken her lady's maid the better part of the morning. She walked with a new confidence, a new ownership of the space around her, as though she had already rehearsed entering this room as its mistress. She lifted her left hand. The ring was magnificent. 3 diamonds clustered at the center, each one catching the afternoon light and throwing it in every direction. It was the kind of ring designed to be seen from across a ballroom. The maid who had shown her in stood frozen near the doorway. From the corridor outside came the sound of 2 other servants stopping mid-step and going still. Everyone was waiting. "My dear," Lettice said, her voice warm and trembling with barely contained triumph. "I came because I had to tell you myself. His Grace has asked me to become his Duchess." The room held its breath. Theodosia stood. She crossed the distance between them with unhurried steps, and she took both of Lettice's hands in her own. The diamond ring pressed cold and sharp against her palm. She smiled. "Congratulations," she said. Lettice blinked. The word landed wrong somehow. Too easy. Too clean. "You're not angry?" Theodosia laughed, a soft sound, almost musical. "Why would I be?" She leaned closer. Close enough that her voice went beneath the hearing of the maid, beneath the hearing of anyone else in the corridor, or the gardens, or the kingdom. Her lips were near Lettice's ear when she spoke. "You think you're taking my place," she said quietly. "You're only taking my problems." Lettice pulled back. She searched Theodosia's face for the heartbreak she had expected to find, the shattered expression of a woman watching her world collapse. She found nothing of the kind. Only that same arranged warmth. Only those calm, clear eyes. She laughed. She decided Theodosia was performing dignity, hiding devastation behind a graceful exit line. She had no way of knowing those 11 words were the truest thing anyone in Blackwood Estate had spoken in 7 years. She had no way of knowing she would spend the rest of her life trying to forget them. 3 days before Lettice arrived with her diamond ring, the kingdom had gathered for the harvest ball. The royal palace opened its grandest hall every autumn for the occasion. Crystal chandeliers burned above 200 candles each. The orchestra occupied an entire elevated platform at the far end of the room, 12 musicians in matching blue coats who had been rehearsing the program since late summer. Dukes and duchesses, earls and countesses, foreign ambassadors and their retinues, young ladies making their first appearances at court, and old lords making what everyone suspected might be their last. They filled the room until the warmth of so many bodies made the candles flicker. The master of ceremonies struck his staff against the marble floor. His Grace, Duke Ambrose Blackmore of Blackwood Estate. Her Grace, Duchess Theodosia Blackmore. The great doors opened. Ambrose entered first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a military coat of deep black trimmed with silver that caught the light as he moved. He had the kind of face that commanded a room without effort. Strong jaw, cool gray eyes, the practiced ease of a man who had never once needed to wonder whether he belonged in any space he entered. Beside him, Theodosia. The gown was ivory silk, embroidered from the waist down with sapphire flowers so fine they seemed to have grown from the fabric rather than been stitched into it. At her throat, the famous Blackmore sapphire necklace. Deep blue stones in a platinum setting that had been in the family for 4 generations. She moved the way she had been taught to move, spine straight, chin level, steps measured, so that the gown never gathered or bunched against the floor. Every conversation in the room paused. Her Majesty the Queen looked up from the dais and smiled warmly. Several young ladies near the refreshment tables turned to each other with wide eyes. An elderly countess touched her companion's arm. 3 noble women approached Ambrose within the first 20 minutes, each one requesting the honor of a dance. He declined each with a patient smile and the same sentence. "Every dance this evening belongs to my Duchess." Near the east windows, 2 countesses watched with undisguised envy. "If my husband looked at me the way that man looks at his wife," the first one said, "I would never complain about another thing in my life." Her companion nodded. "She was born in a farming cottage. Did you know? Nothing to her name. And now look at her. Luck, they called it. Fortune. A blessed marriage." Theodosia heard none of it. She was watching lettuce. Her childhood friend stood near the far side of the room, applauding with everyone else, wearing a smile that was 2 degrees too wide. Theodosia had seen that smile before. She knew the exact shape of the feeling behind it. Not admiration, not happiness for a friend. Something hungrier than that. Something that had been quietly growing for a long time. When the orchestra began a new waltz, Ambrose extended his hand. Theodosia accepted it. They moved onto the floor together, and she performed the dance as she had performed every other part of the evening, precisely, beautifully, and entirely alone. The carriage ride home was the part she always dreaded most. Not because anything happened on the way, because of what always waited at the end of it. Ambrose wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders as the evening air grew cold. The coachman kept a careful pace over the cobblestones. Outside, the stable boys stood straighter when the carriage rolled through the gates of Blackwood Estate, and one of them whispered something to the other that made the older coachman smile. The great oak doors closed behind them. The servants vanished. "You smiled too much at Prince Adrian," Ambrose said. His voice was completely flat. "Not angry yet. That came later." The flat voice was worse in its own way, because it meant the decision had already been made, and there was nothing she could do now to change the outcome. Theodosia turned to face him. "He only congratulated us on the harvest. I thanked him as—" His hand closed around the sapphire necklace. The clasp snapped. The stones scattered across the marble floor of the drawing room in a sound like small bells, rolling beneath the furniture, disappearing into corners. The necklace struck the floor with a dull crack. "Your Grace!" The blow came hard and fast. She lost her balance and caught the edge of the writing desk, stopping herself from falling. The room swam. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed against her jaw. In the corridor outside, The elderly housekeeper lowered her head. She had been in service at Blackwood Estate for 31 years. She had learned long ago that there was nothing she could do in this moment. She pulled the drawing-room door gently closed, and she walked to the kitchen to put the kettle on, because in the morning her Grace would need hot water, and she needed something to do with her hands. Inside the drawing-room, Ambrose stood over his wife and spoke for 40 minutes. The way she had entered the ballroom, the way she had laughed at someone's joke near the refreshment table, the way she had allowed Prince Adrian to bow over her hand for 3 seconds longer than was strictly necessary, the slight imperfection in her posture during the third dance. Her breathing, he said, had embarrassed him. The way she breathed in company was not the way a duchess should breathe. Theodosia knelt when he told her to kneel. She answered every accusation with the same phrase, "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I will do better." She did not cry. She had learned that tears extended these evenings considerably. When he finally moved toward the door, he paused with his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "the kingdom will once again see a happy duchess." She swallowed the burning behind her eyes. "Yes, Your Grace." Far beyond the estate gates, in the small farming village where Theodosia had grown up, her father, Barnaby Fairmont, was still awake. He sat at the kitchen table across from a neighbor who had attended the harvest ball as part of a merchant's delegation, and Barnaby smiled as the man described seeing his daughter enter on the Duke's arm. "A credit to this family," Barnaby said, refilling both their cups. "The greatest blessing God ever sent us." It was the same thing he said every time someone mentioned his daughter's marriage. He believed it completely. He had to. Across the village, his son Leopold Fairmont studied by candlelight in his room at the Royal Noble Academy dormitories, paid for by the Duke of Blackwood. His daughter Thomasina Fairmont slept peacefully in the finishing school that Ambrose had selected and funded without being asked. Every autumn, wagons came from Blackwood Estate, carrying grain and livestock and coin, enough to keep the household comfortable through the winter. The family had been rescued. That was the story. That was the only version any of them allowed themselves to tell. In her drawing room at Blackwood Estate, Theodosia sat on the edge of the settee and quietly gathered the scattered sapphire stones from the floor, placing them one by one into her palm. She would have them restrung. She always did. By the next public occasion, the necklace would be repaired and she would wear it, and people would admire it and say what a devoted husband the Duke must be to give his wife such beautiful things. She set the stones on the table. She stood. She climbed the stairs to her room. She did not sleep for a long time. Hope was a small thing. Theodosia had learned to be suspicious of it. Every time she had allowed herself to believe in something better, the believing had only made the fall harder. So when the estate physician confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks, quietly, in her private sitting room, with the curtains drawn and the door latched, she did not let herself feel too much. She thanked him. She waited until he had gone. Then she sat very still in the chair beside the window for a long time. Finally, slowly, she placed both hands across her stomach. "Hello," she whispered. She did not tell Ambrose. Not yet. Not yet. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, and perhaps that was true. But she also knew the real reason was that she was afraid of what the knowledge might become in his hands. She wanted to hold it for a while longer, something that belonged only to her. In the weeks that followed, she woke earlier than usual. She would lie in the gray morning light with her hands resting gently over her stomach and speak in the softest voice she could manage. Little things, nothing important, just words to fill the silence. She told the child about the elm trees in the estate garden and how they turned copper in autumn. She described the sound the fountain made on still mornings. She talked about her own childhood, the cottage with the low ceiling and the smell of bread baking, the field behind the house where she had run until she fell down in the long grass and stared up at the sky. She had never talked so much in her life. In her private sitting room, she worked on a small blanket in the afternoons, ivory wool with tiny embroidered flowers at the border, cornflowers and sweet peas, because those had been her mother's favorites once. She made a pair of white slippers no larger than her palm. She began a second blanket in the evenings, pale yellow this time. The elderly seamstress came upon her one afternoon, carrying a bolt of fabric, and stopped in the doorway when she saw the tiny garments spread across the work table. "Your Grace," she said softly. She came forward and set down the fabric, and stood looking at the small slippers for a moment. "Does His Grace know?" Theodosia looked at the blanket in her hands. "Not yet." The seamstress said nothing for a little while. Then, "Will you tell him soon?" "I want to surprise him." She looked up. "I want it to be a good moment, a quiet one. Perhaps it will—" She stopped. "Perhaps it will make a difference," the seamstress said gently. Theodosia nodded. She did not finish the sentence aloud. She had finished it inside her own heart. Perhaps becoming a father will reach something in him that nothing else has reached. The seamstress placed one weathered hand over Theodosia's. "I pray this child brings peace into your home, your Grace." "So do I," Theodosia said. She believed it. For a while, for a few weeks of mornings and embroidered flowers and whispered words in the gray light, she truly believed it. The evening everything ended began with soup. Ambrose returned from a long council meeting in a temper that filled the entrance hall the moment the door opened. Theodosia heard it in the weight of his footsteps on the marble. She heard it in the way he answered the footman's greeting with silence. She sat at the dining table and folded her hands in her lap, and reminded herself, "Be quiet, be still. Make no movement that could be interpreted as provocation." Dinner had been prepared exactly as he required. The table was set correctly. The wine was the vintage he preferred. Everything was precisely in order, except that one of the kitchen maids had fallen violently ill that afternoon, and in the resulting confusion the soup had sat in the tureen slightly too long, and had gone from steaming to merely warm. Ambrose lifted the silver spoon, tasted it. Set the spoon down. The temperature of the dining room dropped. Theodosia reached for the tureen. "I'll have them warm it immediately." He picked up the heavy silver serving dish. She saw it happen, saw his hand close around the handle, saw the motion begin. And she had just enough time to understand what was coming before it connected with her body. And she went down. The floor was very cold against her cheek. She heard the servants freeze. She heard the silence that fell over the entire room, that terrible held-breath silence that meant everyone had understood at once, and no one knew what to do. She put her hand out and tried to push herself up, and the pain in her side stopped her. Then the maid screamed. It was the blood, Theodosia understood later. The maid had screamed because of the blood. The estate physician was at the estate within the hour. He worked through the night. The elderly housekeeper stood in the corridor outside the bedroom with her hands pressed together, not praying exactly, but something close to it. Several of the younger maids sat on the floor near the staircase because they had nowhere else to go. and they needed to be near something. Ambrose went to his study. He poured himself a glass of brandy and drank it standing at the window. The physician came out just after sunrise. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at the housekeeper, and she read the answer in his face before he opened his mouth. She gripped the doorframe. "I'm deeply sorry," he said. He was a careful man, a precise man, and she had seen him deliver difficult news before, but his voice was not steady now. "We couldn't save the baby." The housekeeper covered her mouth. Inside the room, Theodosia lay propped against the pillows. She had heard. She lay very still with her eyes open, and she did not make a sound. The physician came to her bedside and spoke to her gently. Her body, her recovery, what she needed to rest, and she answered all his questions in a quiet voice and thanked him when he was done. After he left, she reached for the side table. The elderly seamstress had placed the blanket there while the physicians were working. The ivory one, the first one, the one with the cornflower border that she had made stitch by stitch through those quiet autumn afternoons. She pulled it against her chest and held it, and she closed her eyes. She did not cry. She had nothing left for tears. She held the blanket. She fell asleep. When she woke, the afternoon light was coming through the curtains. Ambrose was standing at the foot of the bed. She looked at him. For one unguarded second, for one foolish, exhausted, half-awake second, she believed he had come because he was sorry. He looked at her across the length of the bed with complete and perfect indifference, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been moved to the wrong room. "Perhaps," he said, "God knew you weren't worthy of giving me an heir." He turned and left. The door closed with a soft, final click. Theodosia stared at the closed door. She stared at it for a long time, long enough for the afternoon light to move across the floor and reach the far wall. She did not move. She did not speak. The blanket was still in her hands. 3 days later, still too weak to walk quickly, she traveled to the village. She had wrapped herself in a plain gray cloak and hired a cart from the nearest town rather than using the estate carriage, so that no one from Blackwood would know where she had gone. The journey took 2 hours on roads still muddy from the autumn rains. She sat in the back of the cart on a folded sack and watched the countryside pass, and did not think about very much. When the cart stopped on the familiar lane, she climbed down carefully and stood for a moment looking at the cottage. The same low roof, the same wooden gate, smoke rising from the chimney. She knocked. Her mother opened the door and immediately said, "My daughter," in the particular voice that meant she had noticed the way Theodosia was standing. She reached forward and pulled her inside, and for one blessed moment Theodosia was inside the warmth and smell of her childhood kitchen, her mother's arms around her, and she allowed herself to believe that she had come home. She cried. For the first time since the physician had come out of the bedroom with that expression on his face, she actually cried. Deep, choking sobs that she had been holding somewhere beneath her ribs for 3 days. She felt her father come across the room and put his hand on her shoulder. They held her. For approximately 45 seconds, they held her. Then her father stepped back. She felt the change in him even before he spoke. Something careful entering his posture, some calculation beginning behind his eyes. "Did anyone see you come here?" he asked. She couldn't breathe. "I came because I need your help." She pushed up the sleeves of her cloak. She showed them her arms, the purple-green bruises, the thin cuts at her wrists, the yellow marks on her shoulders that were old enough to be fading. She heard her mother gasp, a soft, broken sound. Then the silence stretched. Barnaby Fairmont looked at his daughter's arms. He looked for a long time. Then he lowered his eyes and spoke to the floor. "If you leave the Duke," he said, "your brother loses his place at the academy. Your sister will be sent home from finishing school. The Duke will stop the payments. We will lose the grain, the livestock, the house." He stopped. He looked up. "We will lose everything." "He killed my child," Theodosia said. Her mother made a sound, a small, broken sound. She took both of Theodosia's hands in hers, and she looked at her daughter's face, and she whispered, "My child, please, endure just a little longer." The front door opened. Leopold Fairmont walked in from the outside. He had come home for a study break and had clearly heard more than a few words before entering. He stood in the doorway, looking at his sister, at her arms, at the tears drying on her face. He walked toward her. He knelt down on the kitchen floor in front of her. "Please," he said. His voice was very young. He was 22 years old, and he was kneeling on the kitchen floor of his parents' house and asking his sister to go back. "Just until I graduate. Please, don't destroy my future." Theodosia looked at the top of her brother's head. She looked at her mother's pleading face. She looked at her father standing by the fireplace, looking at the wall, unable to meet her eyes. Not one of them had asked if she had eaten. Not one of them had asked where she would sleep tonight. Not one of them had asked whether she was safe. She pulled her sleeves back down. "I understand," she said. She left before Thomasina came home. She did not see her youngest sister that day, which was perhaps a mercy, because she was not certain she could have survived one more person choosing their future over her life. The cart ride back to Blackwood Estate took 2 hours. She sat in the back, watching the countryside pass. When the estate gates came into view, Ambrose was standing in the entrance hall, visible through the open doors. He watched her cross the courtyard. He watched her climb the steps. He was smiling slightly, the kind of smile that meant he had already known what her family would say. "They reminded you where you belong," he said. She walked past him without answering. She climbed the stairs to her room. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and she thought, "There is no one left." She had believed, until that afternoon, that there was one door remaining, one place she could run. She understood now that the door had never been there. Her family had simply looked like a door from a distance. She sat on the bed until the candles in the corridor went dark. Then she lay down in her clothes, pulled the ivory blanket against her chest, and stared at the ceiling until morning. Winter passed. Spring passed. The bruises faded and returned and faded again. In a rhythm that had become so familiar, she had almost stopped registering it as something that should not be happening. She had learned to move through Blackwood Estate like water, fitting herself around every obstacle, never pushing, never resisting, simply finding the path of least resistance and flowing along it. If she moved quietly enough, she was sometimes left alone for days at a time. Alone was the closest thing to peace she had learned to expect. And then, in the late summer of her 7th year as Duchess of Blackwood, the estate physician came to her private sitting room and confirmed what she had not allowed herself to hope. She was expecting again. She sent the physician away before she let herself feel anything. She sat in the chair beside the window, the same chair where she had sat 14 months ago when he'd delivered the same news, and she pressed her hands flat against the fabric of her dress, and she breathed. The first thought was terror. The second thought arrived more slowly, quieter, creeping in beneath the terror like light under a door. This time will be different. This time I know what to protect it from. She went to find the physician before he had left the estate grounds. "Please," she said. She kept her voice low and even. "Don't tell His Grace." He turned. He studied her face for a long moment. "My lady," he began. "If he doesn't know," she said, "perhaps this child will live." He, the physician, was not a man given to visible emotion, but he was a man who had been present for 2 miscarriages in this house, both of which had been entered in the official estate records as accidents. He had signed those records. He had never once believed them. He gave a respectful nod. He left without another word. Only one other person learned the secret. The elderly housekeeper, Marta. Though almost no one used her name anymore, everyone simply called her the old housekeeper, as though she had been born into the role. Was gathering linens outside the sitting-room door when Theodosia stopped her. She told her. Marta sat down on the linen chest in the corridor. She sat down because her legs gave slightly. She pressed one hand over her heart and looked at Theodosia for a long moment. Then she took both of Theodosia's hands in her own dry, warm, work-roughened ones. "This time," she said, "we will protect this little one." Theodosia nodded. She did not trust her voice. "I don't need anything else," she managed. "I only want this child to survive." Marta squeezed her hands. The secret passed between them and stayed there, and the old housekeeper began reorganizing the daily schedules of the household in small ways, making sure Theodosia was never near the staircase when Ambrose was in a black mood, making sure the kitchen never ran late with meals, making sure the wine decanter was always full when he returned from council meetings. It was not enough to stop what was coming, but it was the only thing Marta had to give, and she gave it completely. Lady Lettice Fairmont had begun visiting Blackwood Estate in the spring, and by late summer she was arriving almost every week. She brought flowers from her family's gardens. She brought books from the capital, tea she had discovered at a new merchant's shop, pastries wrapped in cloth that were still warm when she arrived. She settled into Theodosia's drawing room as though it were her own and talked about court gossip and the season and whatever novel she was currently reading, and Theodosia found that having her there was easier than the silence. Easier and, she thought, good for the household. When Lettice was present, Ambrose was in a better mood. He laughed more. His temper ran shorter in duration, though not in intensity. She was grateful. She interpreted his improved mood as gratitude for company, for color, for someone who brought lightness into the heavy rooms of Blackwood Estate. She did not allow herself to look at what she was actually seeing. She did not notice the way Lettice's voice softened 2 full registers when Ambrose entered a room. She did not register how Lettice's spine straightened, how her laugh became half a pitch higher, how she turned slightly on her seat whenever he was nearby, angling herself in his direction like a flower toward light. She heard the compliments. "His Grace has remarkable judgment. The tenants are so fortunate, a man of such vision." And she absorbed them as general praise rather than targeted pursuit. She was tired. She was frightened for the child she was carrying. She was grateful for the lightness. She chose not to look. The night she finally saw it, the air was cool and still and smelled of late summer roses. She had not been sleeping well. The child had begun to move in the evenings, small insistent flutters that kept her lying awake in the dark, with her hands pressed over the slight curve of her stomach. It was not unpleasant. It was, in fact, the only part of any day that she looked forward to, but it kept her from rest, and she had started lying awake until well past midnight, listening to the estate settle around her. Just after 12, she noticed the lantern, a small light, moving through the garden below, moving steadily, not hurriedly, in the direction of the old fountain and the ancient oak tree that stood at the far edge of the formal garden. The tree whose roots had cracked the stone path around it years ago and which no one had ever cut down, because it had stood in that spot since before the estate was built. She did not know exactly why she followed it. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved through the darkened corridors of the estate without lighting her own candle, finding the way by memory and by the moonlight coming through the high windows. She went down the servants' staircase, through the back passage, and out through the conservatory door that opened directly onto the garden. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of roses and of something slightly damp beneath it, the deep green smell of the earth after a hot day. The moon was nearly full. She could see clearly enough to walk without stumbling. She heard the voice before she saw them. Lettuce's laugh, low and private, not the public laugh she used in drawing rooms. Theodosia slowed. She moved to the side of the path, stepping off the gravel onto the grass so her footsteps made no sound, and she came around the edge of a tall boxwood hedge and saw them. Ambrose was standing beneath the old oak tree. Lettuce stood facing him, close, not quite touching. He was holding both her hands, those hands that had struck his wife across the face more times than she had counted, with a gentleness she had not seen directed at herself in years. Perhaps never. She was not certain she could remember. She pressed herself against the hedge and did not move. "I almost pity her," Lettuce was saying, quietly, privately, the voice of someone who believes they are alone. Ambrose smirked. Not a smile, a smirk, the expression of a man who is pleased with his own cleverness. "You pity my wife. She isn't the woman you deserve to concern yourself with anymore." Lettuce looked toward the estate, at the dark windows, at the carved stone facade standing silver in the moonlight. "She was your choice once. She stopped being that woman long ago." His voice was flat, dismissive, the voice he used for broken things. A pause. Then Lettuce asked the question she had clearly prepared, the question she had been building toward through weeks of soft voices and strategic praise, and afternoon visits. "If you were free," she said, "would you choose me?" Ambrose did not hesitate. "Soon," he said. "I'll have no reason to keep her." Lettuce's face changed entirely. The careful control dissolved, and what replaced it was naked longing, naked triumph, the expression of someone who has been wanting something for a very long time and has just been told it is almost within reach. "Then I'll finally become the Duchess," she said. Theodosia stood behind the hedge and breathed. She waited for the pain. It was the reasonable thing to expect, the sensation of her chest collapsing, the burning behind her eyes, the specific quality of humiliation that comes from discovering that you were never the person you believed yourself to be in someone else's life. None of it came. What came instead was something so unexpected that it took her nearly a minute to identify it. Relief. She leaned back against the hedge and let the cool night air move over her face, and felt, flooding up through her chest from somewhere she had not accessed in years, a quiet and overwhelming relief. Her eyes closed. Her hands were still pressed over the slight curve of her stomach. She was thinking, clearly and without panic, about the door that had just appeared. She had spent 7 years inside a locked room. She had tried the window. She had tried the door. She had tried asking to be let out, and she had tried simply waiting for someone to release her. Nothing had worked. And she had begun, in the very quiet and very dark hours of the last several months, to believe that the only way out might be through something she did not want to consider. But there was a door. There had always been a door. And it was standing open, and someone else wanted to walk through it. Let her. She stood behind the hedge for another moment. Then she turned and walked back through the garden, through the conservatory, up the servants' staircase, along the dark corridor to her room. She sat down on the floor beside the bed, her back against the wooden frame, her hands in her lap. The moonlight came in through the window and lay in long, pale strips across the floor. She sat in it and thought. She thought about the physician who had nodded and said nothing, about Marta's dry, warm hands, about the child who moved in small flutters in the evenings, about the ivory blanket on the shelf in her sitting room, and the yellow one she had not finished yet, and the tiny white slippers. She thought about what it would take: money, skills, a destination, time. Not much time. She was already running short of it, in more than one sense. She thought about the hidden floorboard on the left side of the bed, beneath the edge of the carpet. She had discovered it by accident 3 years ago, when the carpenter came to repair a warped board, and she had pressed it closed again, and never told anyone. She thought about what might fit beneath it. She sat on the floor for a long time, until her back ached, and the moon had moved past the window, and the room was dark again. Then she got up. She reached under the mattress for the leather diary she had kept since her wedding day, an accounting of prayers mostly. Petitions sent upward toward some hope that the situation would improve, that something would change, that she would wake one morning and find herself in a different life. She opened it to a blank page. She dipped her pen. She wrote one sentence. Today I stopped praying for my marriage to survive and started preparing for my freedom. She closed the diary. She slid it back beneath the mattress. She lay down on the bed, carefully, on her side, with one hand resting over her stomach, and she closed her eyes. The child moved once, gently. She whispered to it in the dark. She described the shop she had seen once in the capital, the windows full of exquisite embroidery, the elegant hand-lettered sign. She described the kind of workshop she would build. She described the smell of coffee in the morning, and the sound of other women working, and the feeling of signing your own name on a bill of sale. She described freedom in such detail that by the time she finished, she could almost feel it around her, like a room she was already living in. Outside the window, the old estate settled and creaked. She slept. The loose floorboard beneath the carpet held 6 gold sovereigns by the end of the first week. Not many. Not enough. But it was a beginning, and Theodosia had learned to find her courage in beginnings rather than conclusions. Every day she found a small way to move. She sold a brooch she had not worn in 3 years. A small enameled piece, nothing remarkable, the kind of thing Ambrose would never notice missing from the jewelry case. She sold a pair of decorative combs, a bracelet with a broken clasp that she had meant to have repaired and never did. She kept the sapphires and the diamonds, the pieces that Ambrose had actually chosen, because those he would notice. Everything else was hers to spend. She went to Marta early one morning before the household was awake. The old housekeeper was in the linen cupboard, which was where she spent most mornings, refolding, inventorying, keeping her hands occupied. When Theodosia appeared in the doorway, she turned without surprise, as though she had been expecting her. "I need to learn," Theodosia said simply. Marta looked at her for a long moment. "The seamstress owes me a favor from 1842, she said. She taught the old Duchess all the royal court techniques. I'll ask her to teach you. No questions, no alarm, just the particular loyalty of a woman who had spent 31 years watching something terrible happen in a house she could not leave, and who had been waiting a very long time for the chance to be useful. The lessons began the following afternoon. The estate seamstress, a compact, bright-eyed woman named Agnes, who had trained at the royal court before Ambrose's father brought her to Blackwood, spread her best work across the sitting-room table and began where teachers always begin, with fundamentals that most students think they already know. "Why does a duchess need to learn royal embroidery?" Agnes asked on the second afternoon. Not suspiciously, curiously. Theodosia was practicing a French knot, placing it with precision along a curved line. "Because titles don't always last forever," she said. Agnes asked no further questions. She simply taught. Theodosia's fingers were already skilled. The work she had done for herself over the years, the baby clothes, the pillow covers, the decorative pieces she had made to fill the hours, had given her a foundation. What Agnes was adding now was architecture, the structural techniques, the way royal artisans built depth into flat cloth, created texture that moved differently in different lights, achieved the particular denseness of stitching that distinguished court-quality work from anything that could be bought in a market. The lessons hurt. Her fingers were not accustomed to the sustained precision Agnes required, and by the end of each session they ached deeply, the small joints swollen. She soaked them in cold water before sleep and started again in the morning. She also began spending time with the estate steward. This required more creativity. She invented a project, a thorough review of the household accounts, which she presented to Ambrose as an attempt to identify areas where the estate was spending unnecessarily. He found the idea reasonable, perhaps even mildly flattering, and granted her access to the ledgers without much thought. He did not imagine, and would not have imagined in his most suspicious moment, that she was using the access to learn bookkeeping from scratch. The steward, a mild, methodical man named Carver who had managed the estate accounts for 11 years, walked her through the ledgers with the careful patience of a man who is pleasantly surprised to find his mistress genuinely interested in the material. She asked intelligent questions. She took notes in a small book she kept in her sitting room and reviewed after each session. She asked about suppliers, about trade routes, about the difference between the prices the estate paid and the prices she had seen quoted at market when she accompanied Ambrose to the capital. She was building a map, not a map of roads, but a map of commerce. How money moved, where it pooled, where it could be directed by a person who understood its roots. Lettuce arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a new kind of energy. She had always been warm, always slightly too present, always performing brightness at a pitch slightly above what the room required. But something had shifted since the night in the garden. She was more certain now, more settled in her assumption of belonging. She arranged the drawing-room furniture slightly when she sat down, pulling her chair a few inches closer to the center, adjusting the angle of the flower vase. Small, unconscious acts of ownership. Theodosia poured the tea. She had thought carefully about this conversation. Not about what she would say, exactly, but about what she needed the conversation to do. She needed Lettuce to leave this room convinced that the hesitation she'd felt, whatever small, guilty thing had kept her from fully committing, had been resolved. She needed Lettuce to believe there was nothing to feel guilty about. "I've been thinking," Theodosia said, after a period of ordinary conversation about nothing. She sighed. Just once. Just lightly. Just enough. "I think I've failed His Grace." Lettuce looked up sharply. "Don't say that." "I mean it." Theodosia, looked down at her teacup. I love him. I've always loved him. But love isn't always the right foundation, is it? Not a question. A quiet, sad conclusion. Some people deserve more than what love alone can give them. Lettuce was very still. He deserves a woman who understands his ambitions, Theodosia continued. Her voice was even, ruminative, the voice of someone thinking through a difficult truth. Someone who can stand beside a man of his position without shrinking, without disappointing him in the small ways that add up over years. She finally looked at her friend. I'm not certain I'm that woman anymore. Perhaps I never was. Lettuce looked at her hands. She was fighting something. The brightness in her eyes gave it away. The slight tension at the corner of her mouth that meant she was trying not to show how much she wanted to ask what Theodosia was saying, what she was giving permission for. He deserves someone stronger than I am, Theodosia said. It was the sentence that mattered. She had constructed it precisely. Not you, not a specific person, just someone stronger. Because she understood that Lettuce needed to believe she had made the choice herself, that no one had handed it to her. Lettuce lowered her gaze. She said careful words of comfort. She placed her hand over Theodosia's and said she was sure Theodosia was being too hard on herself. She was generous and kind and thoroughly convincing. She left that evening in better spirits than she had arrived. Theodosia watched the carriage until it disappeared through the gates. Then she turned and walked inside, and she opened the leather diary to the page where she had written one sentence weeks ago, and she wrote a second sentence beneath it. Today, I removed the last reason for hesitation. Now, we wait. The estate banquet came in early autumn. 12 guests. 8 from the nobility. 2 merchants of significant standing, 1 member of the King's Council, and the council member's wife. The great dining room had been dressed with the last of the summer flowers, a centerpiece arrangement that Theodosia had supervised herself. The silver was polished. The wine was correct. Everything was exactly as it should be. She had made sure of that. She had made sure of it because she needed the evening to go precisely as Ambrose would want it to go, right up until the moment she chose to let it go differently. Dinner began well. The soup was steaming. The conversation moved around the table in the formal, pleasant patterns of people trying to impress each other without appearing to try. Ambrose was in a good mood. She could read his moods across a room, had been reading them for 7 years as a matter of survival. Then one of the footmen poured wine into the wrong crystal glass. It was a small mistake. The kind of thing that happens at every dinner in every great house in the kingdom at least once a season. Theodosia reached forward immediately, corrected the glass with a quiet word to the servant. A gentle redirect. Nothing that should have been remarkable. Ambrose set down his fork. She had seen this before. The specific way his jaw tightened. The way he stopped tracking the conversation and started tracking something else entirely. She had spent 7 years learning how to interrupt this process, how to redirect his attention, how to smooth the moment before it cracked open. She did not do it this time. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. He rose from his chair. I have tolerated incompetence for too long, he said. Every conversation at the table stopped. 12 people turned to look at him. He let the silence last for 5 full seconds before he continued. And in those 5 seconds, Theodosia understood exactly what he was going to do. He was going to make her into an example. He was going to use this room full of witnesses to demonstrate something. And the something was that he was powerful and she was not. He had done it before. The difference was that this time she was not going to try to prevent it. "This household has become an embarrassment," he said. His voice was carrying, designed to carry, projected toward the far end of the room. "My wife cannot manage servants, cannot manage an estate, cannot, after 7 years, provide me with the one thing this family requires." His eyes fell on her. "From this day forward, you are no longer my wife." The silence was absolute. Theodosia let the moment breathe. Then she bowed her head. Then the tears came. She had always been able to produce them when she needed them, had been doing it for years, and they served her now as they always had. She reached toward him with trembling hands. "Please," she said. Her voice broke precisely right. "Please don't cast me aside. I'll do better. I'll become the wife you deserve." Several of the ladies at the table had gone pale. The elderly earl at the far end was staring at Ambrose with an expression that was not admiration. Ambrose stood straighter. He believed every word. She made sure he believed it until the very last moment. The servants packed her trunk, a small one. She had made sure the contents were specifically what she would need. The coins, the few essential garments, the leather diary, the ivory blanket at the very bottom. She walked through the entrance hall. She walked toward the great front doors of Blackwood Estate. And she stopped. Not because she hesitated. She stopped because she had decided, weeks ago, in the dark beside her bed, with her hands pressed over a child she was no longer carrying. She had lost the second one in her 6th month. A quiet grief she had buried so deep she could almost pretend she had recovered. That she would not leave this house without saying one true thing. She did not turn to face the room. She turned to face Ambrose. He was standing 3 steps behind her, close enough to hear her, close enough that she could speak at a volume that did not reach the guests still frozen at the dining table. She looked at him. She looked at him fully, without the downcast eyes, without the careful arrangement of her face, without any of the 7 years of performed submission between them. "You broke everything you touched," she said. "Your china, your necklaces, your children, your wife." She held his gaze. "But you never broke me." He stared at her. She turned and walked out the door. Lettuce was waiting at the bottom of the front steps. She was wearing the emerald gown Theodosia had not seen before. The diamond necklace sparkled at her throat. She had positioned herself so that she would be seen arriving at precisely the moment the former Duchess was departing. And she had timed it perfectly. The satisfied brightness in her eyes, the slight lift of her chin. "I finally have everything," she said. Theodosia stopped. She looked at the woman she had known since they were 8 years old, who had climbed the oak tree in her father's garden with her, who had cried at every sad ending in every novel they had read together in the long summer afternoons of girlhood. She almost said it. She felt the words in her mouth. "Ready. Leave. Go home. Don't walk into this house." But she thought about what Lettuce would do with that warning. She thought about how certain Lettuce was, how long she had wanted this, how completely she had convinced herself that what Theodosia had was a prize rather than a sentence. She would not have believed her. And she would have told Ambrose that Theodosia had tried to frighten her on the way out. And whatever slim chance of safety Theodosia was walking toward would have been closed off before she reached the gate. "Take good care of him," Theodosia said instead. Lettuce heard defeat in those words. She heard the last breath of a woman surrendering. She smiled and stepped past her and walked up the front steps of Blackwood Estate. Theodosia watched her go. Then she picked up her trunk and walked down the drive without looking back. She walked until the gates of Blackwood Estate were no longer visible behind her. She did not stop to rest. She did not look back. She kept the trunk in her right hand and her eyes on the road ahead, and she walked until the estate walls disappeared behind a curve in the lane, and then behind the first grove of trees. And then she stood alone on an empty road in the early evening, with the sky going orange in the west and the first stars becoming visible in the east, and she breathed. The nearest town was 4 miles. She knew because she had measured it once, years ago, in the back of the estate carriage on the way to a market, counting the distance with the private attention of a woman who had always believed she might one day need to know. She started walking. The room above the baker's shop was barely large enough to turn around in. The single window faced a narrow alley. When it rained, and it rained frequently, because the town sat in a valley that collected weather from 3 directions, water crept in around the frame and dripped from the corner of the ceiling onto the floor, where she had learned to place a ceramic bowl before going to sleep. The bed was a cot with a straw mattress. The chair wobbled on one leg. The table beneath the window was the right height for writing, but too high for comfortable embroidery work, which meant she spent the first 2 weeks sewing with the fabric spread across her lap and a candle propped on an upturned cup to her left. It was, by every measurable standard, the worst room she had ever occupied. She slept better in it than she had in 7 years. The first week she barely ate. Not by design. She was simply bad at managing the unfamiliar routine of buying her own food with her own money from her own dwindling supply of coins. She bought bread on Monday because it was cheap. She bought a small bunch of carrots on Wednesday. By Friday she had rationed herself to 1 meal a day to make the coins last, and she sat at the table in the pale afternoon light and ate slowly and deliberately and did not allow herself to call it deprivation. She called it calculation. She opened the embroidery she had begun, a small handkerchief, the simplest possible commission, the kind of thing that would take a court-trained artisan 30 minutes and had taken her 2 full afternoons, and looked at it critically. The knots were correct. The spacing was even. The stitch density was not quite what Agnes had shown her. She unpicked 3 rows and began again. On the 8th day, she ran out of bread and had exactly 2 silver coins remaining, and she sat at her table and looked at the 2 coins and thought about what it would mean to fail here. She thought about Barnaby Fairmont asking if anyone had seen her arrive. She thought about her mother whispering, "Endure just a little longer." She thought about Leopold on his knees on the kitchen floor. She picked up the needle and kept stitching. The handkerchief sold on Thursday. The merchant's wife at the dry goods shop near the town square had glanced at it when Theodosia laid it on the counter, and then looked again more carefully, and asked where she had learned to work in that particular style. "From an old teacher," Theodosia said. The merchant's wife purchased it for 4 silver coins, twice what Theodosia had hoped for. She walked back to the baker's shop with the coins in her fist, and climbed the stairs, and sat on the cot, and held them in her palm. 4 silver coins. She was a month behind on any reasonable timeline for building a working income. She had a technique no one else in this town had. A handful of materials she was running through faster than she could replenish them, and approximately 0 commercial experience. She went back downstairs and bought better thread. The orders came slowly, then faster. A pair of gloves, embroidered at the cuffs, commissioned by the merchant's wife for her daughter's birthday. A table runner for a baroness visiting her sister in the town, who happened to see the gloves at a dinner party and asked who had made them. A set of pillow covers, a shawl with a golden thread border that she spent 3 weeks on, and which she priced at an amount that made her hands shake when she wrote it on the paper. It sold within a day. Word traveled the way word travels in noble households, through ladies' maids and seamstresses, and the quiet, extensive networks of women who paid attention to beautiful things. Within 6 months, the name being passed from hand to hand was simply Theodosia. No title, no family name. Just the given name that she had been using since the day she rented the room above the baker's shop. The mysterious embroiderer. The woman whose work looked like it belonged in a royal court. The artisan no one had quite managed to trace to a specific origin or establishment. She moved to a larger room. She bought a proper work table. She hired a girl from the baker's shop who had quick fingers and a good eye, and needed the work more than she needed the question of where her employer had come from answered. By the end of the first year, she had rented a small workshop on a proper street. By the end of the second year, she had 6 women working under her, 2 of whom had nowhere else to go, and one of whom had a story that Theodosia recognized from the inside, which was why she paid her more than the others, and never asked her to account for the hours she needed to spend at court hearings across town. The workshop had a window that faced the street, and she dressed it with a sample of her finest work. A length of ivory silk embroidered with a design of her own creation, cornflowers and sweet peas, because those had been her mother's favorites once, and they were hers now too. She was measuring a new commission on a bright October morning when Marta arrived. The old housekeeper had traveled from the estate without telling anyone. She stood in the doorway of the workshop with her coat still on, and her traveling bag in her hand, and looked at the room, at the work tables, and the women bent over their frames, and the samples covering every inch of the walls, and her face did something complicated. "I told them I was visiting my sister," she said. Theodosia crossed the room and embraced her. Marta held on for a moment longer than usual. "You look well," the housekeeper said, pulling back to examine her. "You look different," Theodosia suggested. "Alive," Marta said. She stayed for 3 days. She helped with the administrative work. Marta had been managing the records of a large estate household for 3 decades, and her organizational instincts applied without adjustment to the workshop ledgers. She sorted supplier invoices and reorganized the commission queue, and explained, without being asked, why 3 of the thread merchants were overcharging. On her last evening, sitting beside the work table with a cup of tea, she told Theodosia what she had been telling her for 3 days, in careful, indirect ways. Things at Blackwood Estate had changed. "She's not happy," Marta said. She did not need to name who. Theodosia set down her cup. "I know." She tries to hide it. Marta looked into her tea. "She's become very good at it, actually. Very quickly." A pause. Rather, too quickly. They sat in silence for a moment. "She's going to need somewhere to go," Marta said. "She won't take it," Theodosia said. "Not yet." "She's not ready to admit it yet." Marta looked at her steadily. "And when she is?" Theodosia picked up her cup. "Then I'll be here." Lettuce arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon, 6 months later. She came in a plain hired carriage. No estate livery, no footman, no lady's maid. She wore a high-collared dress in dark blue that covered her neck completely, and the wide brim of her bonnet cast a shadow across the left side of her face. She stood in the doorway of the workshop for several seconds before coming in. She was looking at the women at the tables, at the work on the walls, at the work table where Theodosia stood, with a half-finished commission spread before her. Theodosia saw her. She set down the needle. She crossed the room and said, quietly, to the young assistant nearest the door, "Would you please put the kettle on?" Not a question. She led Lettuce into the small private sitting room at the back of the workshop, a room she had added specifically for consultations with clients who needed privacy. And she closed the door. They stood looking at each other. Lettuce reached up and unpinned her bonnet. She set it on the table. She straightened and let Theodosia see the left side of her face. The bruise was 7 days old, in the yellow-green stage of fading. The angle of it, the shape, was not unfamiliar. Theodosia looked at it. She kept her face still. "You've come a long way," she said. She gestured to the chair nearest the window. Lettuce sat. Theodosia sat across from her. When the assistant brought tea and left again, closing the door, Lettuce wrapped both hands around her cup and stared into it. "I thought I had won," she said. Her voice was stripped of everything. No social polish, no careful brightness, nothing left to perform behind. "I thought you were jealous. I thought—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I thought you were lying about being happy for me. I thought it was an act." She looked up. "And then I spent a year trying to understand why you were so good at it." Theodosia said nothing. "Why didn't you stop me?" Lettuce asked. The question was simple and terrible and old, the question she had been carrying for a year. "You knew. You knew from the beginning. Why didn't you warn me?" Theodosia looked at her steadily. "Would you have believed me?" Lettuce opened her mouth. She closed it. She thought, and Theodosia watched her think, watched the memory of herself move across Lettuce's face, the certainty she had worn like armor, the blindness she had mistaken for clarity. "No," Lettuce said slowly. "I wouldn't have." "No," Theodosia agreed. The word fell between them and sat there. "You let me walk in," Lettuce said. Not an accusation, closer to wonder. "I let you choose," Theodosia said. "There's a difference." Fresh tears ran down Lettuce's face, around the edge of the healing bruise. "I'm sorry," she said. "I stole your life." Theodosia shook her head, the smallest movement. "You took my prison," she said. "I had been trying to find the door for years. You opened it." Lettuce cried quietly for a while. Theodosia poured more tea and let her. When the crying slowed, Lettuce looked at her across the table. "Can you forgive me?" Theodosia reached across and placed her hand over Lettuce's. "I forgave you the day I walked out the door," she said. "You were never my greatest enemy. We were both trying to survive the same man, in different ways." Lettuce looked at their hands. She breathed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I need to leave him." "Yes," Theodosia said. "You do." "He'll try to stop me. He'll cut my family off. I know what he'll do," Theodosia said. "I also know a good solicitor and a physician willing to testify to what he's seen at Blackwood Estate." "You won't be doing this alone." She paused. "You were never going to have to do this alone, Lettuce. I was always going to help you when you were ready." Lettuce looked at her for a long moment. Then she began to cry again, a different kind of crying. Slower, deeper. The kind that comes from being helped instead of abandoned. Theodosia held her hand and let her cry. Lettuce did not get the chance to leave. She returned to Blackwood Estate that evening, determined to begin quietly preparing, to collect what she needed and write to her family, and reach out to the solicitor whose name Theodosia had given her. She arrived home to find Ambrose already awake, already waiting. He had been reading in his study when she came in. He looked up. "You've been to see her," he said. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The expression on his face told her that answering would not change anything. He had already decided. She turned toward the door. He reached her in 3 steps. Marta heard it from the kitchen. She heard the sound, the particular quality of it, the pitch and the crash, and the terrible silence that followed. And she ran. The footman ran. The young groom ran from the stables across the courtyard and into the house. They found her at the bottom of the main staircase. The physician was sent for. He worked for 4 hours, and when he came out, he was pale and precise and careful. And he told them she was alive. He told them she was alive, and he told them what she would not recover. The estate was very quiet in the days that followed. Marta sat beside Lettuce's bed through the first night. Ambrose went to his study and did not come out. The servants moved through the corridors with the particular silence of people who have just witnessed something they know they will have to speak about eventually, and are gathering themselves for the telling. On the second morning, Lettuce opened her eyes. She could not move her hands. She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and understood what had happened to her body and what would not return to it. She was very still for a long time. Then she turned her head toward Marta. "Please, bring me my friend," she whispered. Theodosia arrived at Blackwood Estate at sunset. She stood at the gates for a moment. The fountain still ran in the courtyard. The formal garden was still perfectly trimmed. The stone facade still caught the last of the evening light in the way it always had. It looked exactly the same. She walked through. Marta met her at the entrance. The old housekeeper did not speak. She simply held her for a moment, and then she led her upstairs. The room smelled of medicine and of the particular stillness that collects in a sick room. Lettuce lay with her eyes closed when Theodosia entered. She opened them as the door closed, and she found Theodosia's face, and what crossed her own face was something Theodosia had not expected. Not sorrow, not desperation, peace. A fractured, painful peace, but peace nonetheless. Theodosia crossed to the bed. She pulled the chair close. She took Lettuce's hand, cool, still, the hand of someone whose body had been very thoroughly decided for her, and held it. "I thought I'd won," Lettuce said. The same words she had spoken in the workshop, but different now, lighter. "I thought you lost." "I know. I was wrong about everything." "Not everything," Theodosia said. "You were right that the title was worth wanting. You were wrong about what came with it. A small, broken sound that might have been a laugh. You were always so precise. You always said it was annoying. I was wrong about that, too." They sat together in the quiet. Outside the window, the estate garden was going dark, the shapes of the hedgerows becoming shadows, and then simply darkness. "Can you forgive me?" Lettuce asked. The same question as in the workshop, but she was asking something different now. She was asking it as a woman who understood she might not have much time left to hear the answer. Theodosia looked at her friend's face, the face she had known since childhood, in the oak tree and in the long summer fields, and in this house that had been neither of their homes in any real sense. "I forgave you the day I walked away," she said. "I meant it then. I mean it now." Lettuce closed her eyes. The tension in her face released, slowly, like something untying. "Good," she said softly. She slept. She did not wake again. Barnaby Fairmont arrived at Blackwood Estate 3 days after his daughter's death. He had been traveling when Lettuce's letter reached his house. The last letter she had ever written. The one the stable boy had failed to deliver. The one Ambrose had torn into pieces and scattered on the bedroom floor. A copy had reached him through channels that Marta, who had served this family for 31 years and knew every postal route in the county, had quietly arranged before Lettuce died. He came with grief on his face. He came with the expression of a man who has understood something too late. He stayed for 3 days. He spoke to the physician. He spoke to the footman and the kitchen staff, and the groom who had run from the stables. He sat with Marta for 2 full hours, listening. Then he went to the magistrate. The hearing lasted 11 days. Marta spoke first. She had been rehearsing for 31 years, in the sense that she had been watching and remembering for 31 years, and she stood before the magistrate with her hands folded and her voice steady, and she accounted for every occasion she had been present for in this house. She named dates when she remembered them. She described what she had heard, what she had seen, what the estate physician had told her, what the servants had told each other in the kitchen in the mornings when they thought no one was listening. The estate physician spoke second. He had signed 2 miscarriage reports. He told the court what he had actually witnessed, and what the difference was between what he had written and what was true. The kitchen staff came after. The footman. The young groom. The seamstress Agnes, who described a conversation in a sitting room about why a duchess might need to earn her own living. The elderly earl, who had sat at the harvest banquet dinner and muttered, "This is too cruel," submitted a written account of that evening. He was specific about what he had heard and seen, and the expression on his host's face while saying it. When it was finished, the verdict was delivered by a court that had been presented with 11 days of evidence from 32 separate witnesses. Ambrose Blackmore stood in the dock and heard himself named systematically and precisely for everything he had done. Theodosia was not present for the hearing. She had given her account in a written statement, 3 pages in careful handwriting, dates and descriptions, and the specific language of specific evenings that she had carried in her memory with the same precision she brought to her embroidery. She had signed it. She had had it witnessed. She had sent it by courier and gone back to her workshop. She was there when Marta sent word that the verdict had come in. She was measuring thread at the work table. She set down the thread. She sat for a moment. Then she thanked the messenger, picked up the thread, and kept working. The women at the tables looked at her. "The hearing concluded," she said. "As expected." She looked around the room. "Ambrose Blackmore's title has been stripped by royal decree. Blackwood estate is being reviewed by the Crown." She paused. "You will see nothing change here. We continue." One of the women, the one who had spent months attending court hearings across town, whose story Theodosia had recognized from the inside, looked at her steadily and nodded. They continued. The Fairmont family arrived one morning in late autumn without sending word ahead. She saw them from the workshop window. Barnaby in his good coat, Doratha holding a handkerchief, Leopold with his hat in his hands, Thomasina 2 steps behind the rest, her face turned slightly away from the workshop door as though she was still deciding whether to enter. Theodosia set down her needle. She stood. She walked to the door and opened it. They looked at her. Barnaby Fairmont was old in a way he had not been the last time she had seen him. The year had done something to the shape of his face, had taken whatever self-assurance had always inhabited it and replaced it with something quieter and less certain. He stood on the step of her workshop in his good coat, and he looked at his daughter, and then he dropped to his knees on the cobblestones. "We failed you." His voice was barely above a whisper. "We chose our comfort over our own child. We have not had a peaceful day since you left." Doratha was crying openly, her handkerchief pressed against her mouth. Leopold stood behind her with his hat still in his hands, looking at the ground. Thomasina had finally stopped turning away. She stood with her eyes on Theodosia and her hands clasped. Theodosia looked at each of them. She thought about the cottage kitchen, the smell of the fire, her mother's hands, Leopold on his knees. Please, just until I graduate. The night she had walked out the gate, without saying goodbye. She thought about the cot with the straw mattress and the bowl on the floor to catch the rain. She thought about 4 silver coins and what they had built. I forgave all of you long ago, she said. Her father's shoulders dropped. Her mother let out a long breath. But forgiveness, she continued, quietly and clearly, does not restore what was broken. She looked at her father. You asked me if anyone had seen me arrive. I had bruises on both arms, and you asked me if anyone had seen me arrive. She let the words sit, not as cruelty, as fact. I cannot return to the relationship we had before, because the person I was in that relationship is gone. I built someone new out of what was left, and she is not going back. Her father looked up from the cobblestones. I wish you health, she said. I wish you peace. If hardship finds you, I will make sure you do not go hungry. She paused. But I cannot give you the place in my life that I used to reserve for you, because the shape of the space has changed, and it no longer fits. Doratha cried quietly. Thomasina nodded, once small but genuine. Leopold looked at his sister for a long moment. Thank you, he said finally. For being honest, she looked at him. It took me a long time to learn to do that, she said. I had a lot of practice pretending. They left. She watched them go from the workshop doorway, standing in the autumn light, her hand resting on the door frame. She stayed there for a moment after the carriage disappeared, and then she turned and walked back inside. The workshop in winter was the warmest place she had ever occupied. Not because of the stoves, though they kept the room at a temperature that made fine needlework possible even in February. Warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, the particular warmth of a room full of people doing specific skilled work. The warmth of having enough, of knowing where you would sleep and what you would eat, and who would be sitting beside you in the morning. 8 women worked at the long tables now. She knew each of their stories the way she knew the back of her own hand, because she had asked, and because they had told her, in the careful increments of people who have learned that telling is a risk and who have tested her patience before offering the most difficult parts. Helena, who had 3 children and a dead husband, and the quickest eye for color Theodosia had ever encountered. Brigid, who had run from a house in the north, with nothing but the clothes she was wearing, and who could now, 14 months later, be trusted with the most complex commissioned work in the shop. Ruth, who had attended the court hearings across town and whose case had concluded 3 months ago in her favor, and who had cried quietly in the back room for one afternoon, and then returned to her frame and not missed another day of work since. And the others. The shop occupied the entire ground floor of the building now, and she rented the apartment above for storage and for the private sitting room where she met with clients. The window display changed every month. A new length of exquisite work, always featuring the cornflower and sweet pea design she had made her signature. Clients recognized it from across the capital. Ladies asked their seamstresses to source it. A foreign ambassador had commissioned a full set of bed linens in the pattern for a wedding gift, and the order had taken 6 women 3 months to complete and had been displayed in the embassy's public rooms for a season afterward. She still embroidered herself. Not for commission, mostly. In the quiet evenings after the women had gone home, she would work on something that had no deadline and no client. An experiment in technique, a pattern she was developing. The slow and methodical pleasure of building something with her own hands. She was working on a blanket. Ivory wool. cornflowers and sweet peas at the border, the same as always. Larger than the ones she had made years ago in a private sitting room at Blackwood Estate, her hands moving quietly over the fabric while she whispered to someone who was never born. She had no reason to make a blanket that size. She made it anyway. She made it for the same reason she had always made things, because the making was its own meaning. Because the act of creating something careful and beautiful out of raw material was the truest expression she had ever found for what she believed about the world. You could be broken down to the raw material. It happened. It had happened to her, and she had sat on a bare floor and counted it honestly. And then you could begin. One evening in early spring, she locked the workshop and walked home by a route that took her past the old marketplace in the center of town. The stalls were closing for the evening, the vendors packing their remaining goods, the square emptying. A flower seller was bundling the last of her stock, hurrying before the light went. Theodosia stopped at the stall. She bought a small bunch of cornflowers. She walked home with them in her hand, through streets she now knew as well as she had ever known, the corridors of Blackwood Estate. She climbed the stairs to her apartment above the workshop. She filled a small glass with water and put the flowers in it and set them on the work table beside the unfinished blanket. She stood looking at them for a moment. Then she sat down, picked up the needle, and continued. The commission that changed everything arrived in the third year. A letter, hand-delivered by a royal courier in the livery of the Queen's household. She had been in the back of the workshop reviewing supplier invoices when the young assistant knocked and handed it to her with wide eyes. She opened it at the work table, standing. She read it twice. Then she set it down carefully and stood looking at it for a moment. The Queen's household wished to commission a full ceremonial table covering for the annual harvest banquet. The specifications were precise and extensive. A length of fabric nearly 6 meters, embroidered with the royal seal at each corner, and a continuous border design to be agreed upon in consultation with the Queen's head seamstress. At the bottom, in a different hand than the formal request, 2 lines. We have admired your cornflower design for some time. We hope you will agree that it would suit. She sat down. She was quiet for approximately 30 seconds. Then she called Helena over and showed her the letter, and watched Helena's expression move through surprise, and then delight, and then a complicated kind of pride. We'll need to bring in 2 more women for this, Helena said finally. She was already calculating, already moving pieces in her head. Bridget can lead the border work. Ruth handles the seal corners. Her detail work is the finest of anyone here. Agreed, Theodosia said. She wrote back that afternoon. She accepted the commission. She specified the timeline. She signed with her full name, Theodosia, no title, no family connection, and sent it back with the courier. She did not sleep particularly well that night, not from anxiety, but from the particular restlessness of a person who has arrived somewhere they had been walking toward for a long time, and needs a moment to believe they have actually arrived. In the morning she woke early. She came downstairs before any of the women arrived. She unlocked the workshop and stood in the quiet of the empty room, the long tables and the frames and the walls covered in completed and in-progress work. The window facing the street, where a thin winter light was just beginning to gather. She stood in the middle of it and breathed. Then she put the kettle on, because there was work to do. The Royal Commission was completed on the 38th day, 4 days ahead of schedule. When the Queen's head seamstress came to collect it, she stood over the length of folded fabric for a long time without speaking. Unfolding sections and examining the work under a small lens she carried for exactly this purpose. She finally looked up. Where did you train? At a small estate, Theodosia said. Under a woman named Agnes. The seamstress looked back at the fabric. Agnes, she said, as though confirming something she had half suspected. Blackwood's old court seamstress. Yes? She always said her finest student was someone she'd taught in a private setting. The seamstress carefully refolded the fabric. I assumed she meant a private academy. She meant a private sitting room, Theodosia said. The seamstress smiled slightly. She signed the receipt. She left. Theodosia returned to her work table. She picked up the needle. She kept working. There is a kind of victory that no title can give you and no loss can take away. It is not the victory of defeating your enemies or outlasting the cruelty of those who should have protected you. It is the quieter, harder victory of becoming, in the end, entirely yourself. Learning which parts of you survived the wreckage, and which parts you had to build new, and discovering that the built parts are as true as anything you were born with. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be told they are worth something. The wisest among them stop waiting and begin the work of simply being it. And when they look up one day from whatever they are building with their own two hands, they find that the life around them has become, without ceremony or announcement, exactly what they always deserved.